The night they destroyed my husband's name, I sat quietly in the corner of that room and counted every single man who laughed. 12 men. I counted them twice. I memorized their faces. Who laughed first? Who laughed the loudest? Who looked away afterward like shame could erase what they had done? They were the most powerful syndicate bosses in East Asia, and to them, my husband was officially a bankrupt, broken man. And me? I was just his black, quiet wife sitting near the wall, holding a cup of tea while important men talked. They treated me like furniture, completely unaware that I had been running the numbers for weeks. I held that warm cup with both hands and said absolutely nothing, because I already knew something none of them did. I let them laugh, because a man who performs a betrayal in public cannot quietly undo it. And before this week was over, I was going to make them pay for every single chuckle. To understand how a woman from Nairobi ends up holding the strings of a multi-million-dollar Korean criminal enterprise, you have to understand the night the floor gave way beneath us. 3 days earlier, my husband, Park Jae-won, walked into our bedroom at 2 in the morning and sat on the edge of the bed without removing his coat. He stared at the wall in complete silence. I had seen Jae-won face dangerous men without fear. I had seen him receive terrible news without changing his expression. But that night was different. He looked like a man watching his entire life collapse in slow motion, and beneath the stillness, I could see something I had never seen in him before, a quiet, devastating grief, not just for the empire, but for the version of himself he had built it as. Finally, he said very quietly, "The Seoul accounts are frozen. The Macau deal is dead. The ancient contract is gone." He swallowed hard, the weight of generations pressing down on his shoulders. "Amara, we have 11 days left." I looked at him for a long moment, watching the panic flicker behind his eyes. Then I said, "I know." He turned slowly toward me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "You know?" "I've known for 6 weeks," I said. "And I need you to trust me for 3 more days." That was the moment everything changed between us, but I should start earlier. My name is Amara Wanjiku Park. I grew up in Nairobi in a quiet home with a red gate and a mango tree that dropped fruit every March like clockwork. My mother taught mathematics. She spent her evenings sitting at the kitchen table with her red pen, quietly finding mistakes in other people's work. My father came home every evening at exactly 6:15, never early, never late. That was how I learned that quiet things could still be powerful, and that the most important person in a room is often the one nobody notices. I carried that philosophy with me across oceans. I was 31 and working in financial compliance in Singapore when I met Park Jae-won. His lawyers had scheduled the wrong meeting room. Mine were running late, so for almost 10 minutes, it was just the two of us alone in a glass conference room overlooking the harbor. He studied me carefully, taking in my dark skin, my tailored suit, and my complete lack of intimidation. He said, "You're not who I was supposed to meet." I looked back at him and said, "No, but I think I'm who you need to meet." For the first time, he smiled. We talked for 2 hours. Not about business, but about survival, about power, and about what it means to build strength instead of inheriting it. Before his lawyers even arrived, I knew something profound about him. This was a man surrounded by people, but very few who actually saw him. 3 days later, he called and asked me to dinner. I told him, "Tell me what kind of man you are first." There was a long silence on the line, the kind that would make lesser men hang up. Then he said, "The kind with enemies, the kind with regrets, the kind that wants to be honest with you." I smiled to myself, checking my watch. 7 o'clock. You choose the restaurant. I'll choose the conversation. And that was how the most dangerous story of my life began. I need you to understand something about the life I chose. I did not walk into it blindly. I knew exactly what kind of world Park Ji-won belonged to. The Park family operated across 4 countries. Their public businesses were legitimate: shipping, real estate, private security. But beneath that lay something older and far more dangerous, a network built over generations through loyalty, silence, favors, and fear. In Korea, the Park name carried weight. Not respect, consequence. The kind of name that made some men stand straighter and others leave the room entirely. The first time Ji-won brought me to Seoul to meet his family, I wore a dark green dress and spoke very little. Not because I was nervous, but because I was observing his mother. Mrs. Park Sr. studied me silently for almost a full minute, her obsidian eyes cutting through me like a blade. Then she said something sharp in Korean. Ji-won translated it politely. "My mother says, you are elegant." But by then, I already understood enough Korean to know what she had really said. She had actually remarked, "She is harder than she looks." I considered that the ultimate compliment. His older brother, Jaehan, was the kind of man who enjoyed small, petty cruelties because nobody had ever stopped him. At dinner, he refilled every glass at the table except mine. It was a tiny thing, easy to dismiss, but I noticed. His sister-in-law smiled carefully and said, "It must feel strange being so far from home." I looked her dead in the eye and said, "Home travels with me." She did not know how to answer that, her smile freezing on her face. Most of the men around Ji-won treated me like furniture. I was the African wife, the quiet one, the woman sitting near the wall holding tea while important men talked about millions. I let them believe it. Because silence is not weakness, silence is observation. While they ignored me, I learned everything. I learned who truly respected Ji-won, who feared him, who secretly resented him, which smiles were genuine, and which were merely performances. I listened constantly, and nobody noticed. At night, when Ji-won traveled for business, I often thought about my mother sitting at her kitchen table. I was doing the exact same mathematical filtering, only my mistakes were far more dangerous. During the first years of our marriage, I built things quietly, never publicly, never dramatically. I built the kind of things meant to survive a catastrophic storm. Utilizing my corporate background, I maintained financial accounts in multiple countries under fully legal, ironclad structures. Some funds came from my own consulting work, while others came from assets Ji-won officially placed under my management over the years. I insisted on meticulous paperwork for everything. Not because I distrusted my husband, but because a woman without her own foundation eventually becomes helpless in someone else's collapse. I also built strategic relationships completely outside of Ji-won's immediate criminal world. A top-tier corporate lawyer in Seoul whom I had met years earlier in Dubai. Former compliance colleagues tucked away in the financial intelligence sectors of Singapore. A highly discreet mediator trusted by the most powerful traditional Korean families. and a sharp financial journalist in Hong Kong who respected me because I had once given him completely truthful, unvarnished information when everyone else in the industry lied to his face. I never asked any of them for immediate favors. I simply stayed connected quietly, tending to my garden before the winter arrived. At the same time, I kept my eyes locked on the people inside Jaiwan's inner circle. I learned every important name in his network, their hidden ambitions, their mounting weaknesses, and their shifting loyalties. I learned which men owed massive debts, which men were secretly terrified of the future, which men smiled just a little too quickly, and which men only respected power while it was actively winning. I kept all of this data to myself for 7 years. Then, one evening during our 7th year of marriage, Jaiwan came home unusually late. He sat at the kitchen table, his shoulders slumped. "I think someone is moving against us," he admitted. I poured tea for both of us, sat across from him, and said, "Tell me everything." For nearly an hour, he talked about strange, subtle disruptions inside the organization. Contracts were quietly disappearing, phone calls went unreturned, and old allies were suddenly cold and distant. He believed it was just normal pressure, standard competition, or everyday business politics. But as I listened, something felt deeply wrong. It was too organized, too surgically precise. The pressure was landing in exactly the right places at exactly the right times. That meant only one thing: someone close to him was helping it happen. Someone inside his inner sanctum. When he finally finished speaking, I set my cup down and said, "Give me 2 weeks." He looked at me carefully, a flicker of surprise passing through his eyes. "To do what?" he asked. I lifted my tea and said, "To watch." And after a long, heavy silence, he nodded and said, "Okay, I need to tell you about Kang Dong-soo before I tell you what he did, because a betrayal only truly destroys you if you love the person first." Kang Dong-soo had been Jaiwan's closest ally and brother-in-arms for 22 years. He was 60 years old, compact, precise, with impeccably groomed silver hair. He had a distinct habit of adjusting his cufflinks before making any important statement, as though fastening himself into the gravity of the moment. He had stood proudly at our wedding. He had held the door open for my mother when she visited, making her laugh out loud with a joke I didn't quite hear. He had sat at our dinner table more times than I could possibly count. He called Jaiwan his brother in both Korean and English, and once, memorably, he even used a Swahili greeting he had spent an entire week learning specifically to make me feel included in the room. I had watched him do all of these things. But because I am a woman who watches patterns, I had noticed something else over the last 18 months. I had watched Kang Dong-soo's warmth slowly develop a slight, mechanical quality. It became the manufactured warmth of a man maintaining a flawless performance rather than expressing a genuine feeling. There were small, unmistakable tells. The way his eyes darted to the door when he arrived at our home, just briefly, as though confirming his extraction route. The way he asked casual questions about Jaiwan's overseas financial structures with an interest that was just a fraction too specific. The way he laughed at Jaiwan's jokes exactly a half-second too late, as though he were consciously translating the humor rather than naturally responding to it. I had been focusing my gaze entirely on Kang Dong-soo for 6 weeks before I finally unearthed the hard evidence I was looking for. Through my contact in Singapore's financial intelligence community, a woman who owed me a major professional courtesy from years prior, I discovered a sickening reality. Kang Dong-soo had been systematically providing insider information to a South Korean investigative authority for 3 full years. He wasn't doing it out of any high moral principle. He had cut a deal in exchange for absolute protection from his own serious legal exposure in a separate, multi-million-dollar fraud matter. He was not simply a traitor. He was a cooperating government informant who had spent 36 months feeding the exact vulnerabilities of the park organization to the very people who wanted it utterly destroyed. The money that had suddenly vanished from the Hong Kong accounts? Kang Dong-soo. The massive Macau project that was suddenly drowning in an insurmountable wave of legal challenges? Assembled in exactly the right order by someone who understood which specific regulatory authorities to contact, Kang Dong-soo. The highly lucrative Incheon shipping contract that was abruptly redirected to a bitter competitor? Handed over on a silver platter because someone gave the competitor insider knowledge of the park organization's exact bidding vulnerabilities, all orchestrated by Kang Dong-soo. I sat with this devastating knowledge in our empty apartment for 2 full weeks while Jaewon traveled frantically across the continent, trying to hold the crumbling pieces of his empire together with his bare hands while the very floor disappeared beneath his feet. I want you to understand what those 2 weeks felt like from the inside. I am not a person who experiences fear as paralysis. I experience fear as pure information. A chemical signal telling me that a situation requires my absolute, hyper-focused attention. But this was an incredibly tight tightrope. Moving even a day too soon would show Kang Dong-soo exactly what I knew, allowing him to destroy the evidence and accelerate the government raids. Moving a day too late would mean losing absolutely everything we owned, ending with my husband in a high-security prison. I sat at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, entirely alone in the dark, and thought about my father coming home at exactly 6:15. I thought about precision as a form of love. I thought about the tactical fact that the most dangerous moment in any operation is not when you have absolutely nothing. The most dangerous moment is when you have almost enough information, but not quite yet. So, I waited until the trap was perfectly set. From a clean burner phone entirely unconnected to our home network or encrypted servers, I made 8 highly specific phone calls. I sent 6 comprehensive financial dossiers to 3 separate international parties. I arranged 2 critical, high-level conversations that I chose not to physically attend. And then, I waited for Jaewon to come home. That brings us back to the night he sat on the edge of our bed in his buttoned coat and told me we had exactly 11 days of operating cash left before absolute bankruptcy. When I looked at him calmly and revealed that I had known about the entire treasonous play for 6 weeks, his face cycled through a brutal progression of emotions. Shock came first, flattening his expression. Then came something far more complicated, a deep, painful recalibration. But underneath the recalibration, I saw something raw, the wounded pride of a man who had spent his entire life protecting others, only to discover that he was the one who had needed protecting all along. It was the look of a man suddenly realizing that the map he had been using his entire life did not show the true layout of the territory. His voice cracked. Not just slightly, it broke open, the way a man's voice breaks when he is fighting something much larger than anger. You should have told me. If I had told you, I replied softly, you would have reacted out of anger. You would have confronted him. And if you had acted before my counterstructure was fully complete, Kang Dong-soo would have seen it coming, covered his tracks, and triggered the immediate arrest warrants. We would have lost the only tactical advantage we had left. Jaiwan stood up from the bed abruptly, crossed to the window, and pressed both hands flat against the glass. He stared out at the city for a long moment, his breath fogging the surface. When he turned back around, his eyes were wet, not with tears that fell, but with the kind that a man holds through sheer force of will because he has spent a lifetime believing that showing them is the same as losing. 14 years, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You have been carrying this family for 14 years. And I sat at the head of the table thinking I was the one holding everything together. You were holding everything together, I said gently. You just didn't know we were doing it side by side. He swallowed hard. What advantage could we possibly have left? I leaned in closer. The advantage that absolutely nobody in your world has ever bothered to watch me. He stared at my face, the words arriving slowly in his mind like a man reading a complex contract that he needed to parse twice. What exactly have you been doing, Amara? All these years, what have you actually been doing? I reached across the bed and placed my dark hand firmly over his trembling ones. I had been making sure that when this day arrived, and I always knew a day like this would arrive, we would not be standing on nothing. He looked down at our joined hands. Then he looked back up into my eyes, and I watched him truly see me, perhaps for the very first time in our 14 years of marriage, with absolute, unadulterated clarity. He no longer saw me merely as his quiet wife who sat gracefully at the edge of lavish rooms. He saw me for what I actually was, the architect of our survival. And in that moment, he looked less like a syndicate boss and more like a man, a husband, undone by gratitude he didn't yet have the language to express. Kang Dong-soo, he whispered. It wasn't a question. Something in the cold steadiness of my demeanor told him everything he needed to know. Yes, I said. The bedroom became suffocatingly quiet. I watched Jaiwan silently absorb the devastating reality of a 22-year brotherhood exposed as a lie. The wedding. My mother laughing at the front door. The Swahili greeting meticulously memorized over 7 days. All of it was being violently reassembled in his mind with a sinister, calculated meaning. Every warm embrace was revealed as a cold calculation, every grand gesture of loyalty was unmasked as the routine maintenance of a performance. His jaw tightened until the bones showed through his skin. But what broke him, what truly broke him, was not the betrayal of his power. It was the betrayal of his love. 22 years. A brother. He pressed his fist hard against his mouth, holding the sound in, his shoulders shaking once before going completely still. I want to kill him, he rasped, his voice dropping into a register that would terrify any ordinary person. I squeezed his hand tighter. I know exactly what you want to do. And you are going to do absolutely nothing. For 3 days, you are going to play the part of the broken, defeated boss. Can you give me 3 days? He locked eyes with me for a long, agonizing moment. I watched him fight every instinct he had. Then, he let out a slow breath, the breath of a man choosing his wife's plan over his own rage for the very first time. Yes. I believed him. Because Jaiwan, whatever else he was, had always fundamentally understood that the most dangerous thing you can do in a rapidly collapsing situation is move without a bulletproof plan. And for the first time in our marriage, he had decided that the plan belonged entirely to me. The fateful meeting was arranged under the clever pretense of an emergency consultation. 12 allied families were gathering in a secure, soundproofed private dining room in Seoul to discuss the sudden, catastrophic disruptions to the syndicate's shipping and financial networks. That was the cover story. The reality, however, was that Kang Dong-soo had spent months meticulously preparing a public tribunal. It was informal, the brutal kind held in hidden backrooms rather than legitimate courtrooms, but a lethal tribunal nonetheless. He had spent weeks cultivating doubt among the allies and manufacturing a mountain of fraudulent financial evidence pointing to Jaewon's gross mismanagement. The room had been thoroughly persuaded to strip Jaewon of his titles before anyone had even sat down at the table. The day before the meeting, Jaewon had been told very politely over the phone that this emergency gathering was strictly for principals only. Meaning, wives were explicitly barred. Jaewon, following my script perfectly, replied quietly into the receiver, "My wife will be present." There was a heavy, arrogant pause on the other end of the line. Then, a dismissive chuckle. "Of course. If you insist, let her come." Because what were they actually going to say? To them, I was just the quiet African wife. I didn't speak their language fluently in their eyes. I wouldn't dare interfere in the serious business of men. She is harmless, they thought. When we walked into that suffocating room, the disrespect was immediate. No chair had been placed for me at the long mahogany table. Instead, someone had intentionally set a solitary wooden chair far against the side wall, treating me like an unwanted spectator. I took the seat without a single word of comment, smoothing down my dress. I held my warm cup of tea with both hands, my face perfectly arranged into the unthreatening, submissive expression I had spent 14 years perfecting in their presence. The look of a loyal, grieving woman who was only there out of a desperate sense of duty and nothing more. Kang Dong-soo stood confidently at the head of the table, deliberately occupying the high-backed leather chair where Jaewon usually sat. I watched him adjust his silver cufflinks. I thought to myself, you have been rehearsing this exact moment in front of a mirror for a very long time. He laid out his treasonous case with masterful, methodical cruelty. He cited the frozen Seoul account containing $43 million of inaccessible operating capital. He detailed the Macau development project, legally strangled at every single point of operational progress. He listed the Incheon shipping contract. Years of careful building and months of delicate negotiation, hand-delivered to their fiercest competitor in a single government filing. He walked them through the Hong Kong accounts, completely drained in movements that were technically legal but practically catastrophic for the syndicate's payroll. "Associates have completely stopped returning our calls," Kang Dong-soo said, his voice echoing off the wood panels as he looked directly at my husband. "Partners have quietly redirected their cargo. The park name has officially stopped being an asset to this room. It has become a toxic liability." He slammed his hands on the table, leaning in. "The park operation is finished. Anyone still attached to this bankrupt name in 30 days will share the catastrophic legal consequences." The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence for exactly 4 seconds. Then, a man named Boss Beck broke the quiet. Beck was a man who had eaten at our personal dinner table 9 times. He was a man who had once borrowed my husband's luxury sports car and returned it with a significant dent in the bumper that he never even had the decency to mention. Beck leaned back in his chair and roared with laughter. Finished, he barked loudly, his voice dripping with malice. Like a cheap restaurant that ran completely out of food. It was a hideous, wrong kind of laugh. It was too pleased, too thoroughly prepared. It was the precise laugh of a petty man who had been waiting a decade to say that specific derogatory thing to Park Jae-won's face. Within moments, 2 men laughed along with him. Then 3 more joined in. The entire room shifted violently, the way rooms always shift when cowardly men finally figure out which way the wind is blowing. I shifted my eyes to Boss Cho, a man whose daughter I had personally spent 3 months helping with her competitive university admissions essays. A man who had received a premium, hand-selected bottle of wine from me every single Christmas for 11 years. Cho refused to look at my husband. He stared intently down at his own hands, saying absolutely nothing. He did not join the laughter, but more importantly, he did not object to it either. He chose the cowardice of neutrality. Then, a boss named Seo-jin, a highly watchful, precise, and dangerous man whom I had always known to be calculated, spoke up without bothering to look in my direction. "What about the African wife?" Seo-jin asked coldly. He said it with the exact tone a person uses when asking about a useless piece of old furniture when clearing out a foreclosed house. Is she even aware of the scale of the situation? Does she have anywhere to go when the bank seized the properties? Kang Dong-soo slowly turned his head toward me. For the very first time since I had walked into that tribunal, he looked directly into my eyes. He let out a patronizing sigh. "The wife is truly the least of our concerns in this room. She has absolutely no position here. No standing whatsoever." He paused intentionally, allowing a cruel, dramatic silence to hang over the table. He was deeply enjoying his moment of absolute dominance. She is simply an outsider woman who married up, and now, she has absolutely nowhere to go. Beck roared with laughter again, slapping his palm against the table. Across the room, my husband's hands pressed flat against the mahogany. Even from my distant chair against the wall, I could see every single tendon in his wrists pulling so tight they looked ready to snap like steel cables. He was a fraction of a second away from leaping across that table. But it wasn't just fury driving him there, it was something much older and more personal. Every year he had spent watching men overlook me. Every dinner where they reached past me to refill other glasses. Every room where they addressed him as though I were part of the wallpaper. All of it was compounding inside him at once. And now Kang Dong-soo, the man he had called brother, was wielding it as a weapon. I lifted my teacup calmly and took a slow, deliberate sip. The porcelain was still comfortably warm against my fingertips. I locked my gaze directly onto Kang Dong-soo over the rim of my cup. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I let all the cold, mathematical weight of my presence bear down on him from across the room. Kang Dong-soo looked away first, uncomfortably shifting his weight. I lowered my cup back into its saucer with a soft, distinct clink. I thought to myself, 3 more days. Just give me 3 more days, and I will dismantle your entire world. The morning after the tribunal, the world carried on as though my husband's empire hadn't just been publicly dismantled. But inside our apartment, the air was sharp with calculation. Jae-won stood by the window, his back straight, his eyes tracking the morning traffic below. He was a man who had spent his entire life commanding through presence, but today, he was waiting for orders. There was something quietly devastating about that, the image of Park Jae-won, a man entire networks had feared for 2 decades, standing by a window waiting to be told what to do by his wife. He didn't resist it. He simply stood there, and in that posture of chosen surrender, I saw the full measure of his trust. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, 2 burner phones, and 3 neatly organized folders of financial data. Today, I said, not looking up from my screen, we begin the correction. Jae-won turned around. Where do we start? We start with the man who didn't laugh, I replied. Boss Seo-jin. Seo-jin was the most dangerous type of ally because he didn't operate on emotion. He operated entirely on risk management. When he had asked about the African wife during the tribunal, it wasn't out of cruelty, it was an audit. He wanted to know if I was a liability. At 9:15 a.m., I called Seo-jin directly on his private, unlisted line. When he answered, his voice was flat, cautious. Who is this? It's Amara Park, I said, speaking with absolute, calm authority. I am sitting with a set of international banking records from a private trust in Switzerland. They were routed through a dummy corporation registered in Panama under the name Blue Horizon Holdings. Do you recognize that name, Boss Seo-jin? There was a long, heavy silence on the line. I could hear his rhythmic breathing. Blue Horizon was Seo-jin's most heavily guarded secret, an offshore entity he used to shield his personal wealth from both the government and his fellow syndicate bosses. How did you get this number? He rasped. The same way I found the transaction ledger from 3 months ago, I said smoothly. The ledger that shows Kang Dong-soo transferred $4 million into that exact account. He told you it was a payout from the Macau project. What he didn't tell you, Seo-jin, is that the source of that money was a black budget fund managed by the South Korean Financial Prosecution Service. I let the information hang in the air like a blade. Kang Dong-soo did not buy your loyalty, Seo-jin, I whispered. He bought your complicity. The documents he used to set up that transfer are the exact same documents he handed over to the prosecutors to secure his own immunity. If my husband goes down, the paper trail ensures you go down with him as a primary co-conspirator. Kang Dong-soo didn't build a new alliance with you. He built a human shield. I heard the sharp intake of air on the other end of the line. The precise, calculated boss Seo-jin had just realized he was standing on a landmine, and Kang Dong-soo was holding the detonator. What do you want? Seo-jin asked, his voice stripped of all its former cold indifference. I want you at the Grand Hyatt Hotel, Private Suite 402, at exactly 2 o'clock today, I said. Bring your corporate seal and your primary legal counsel. If you are 1 minute late, the unredacted files are sent directly to the Central Investigative Division. Choose wisely, Seo-jin. I hung up before he could respond. I looked up at Jae-won, who was watching me with an expression that bordered on awe. One down, I said, picking up the second phone. Now, let's talk to the ones who laughed. By noon, the legal trap was fully operational. Using the independent financial network I had built over 7 years, I executed a series of precise, devastating maneuvers. Through my compliance contacts in Singapore, I initiated an immediate, aggressive audit of Boss Beck's primary shipping logistics company. Because I had spent years analyzing their operational patterns, I knew exactly which customs declarations were fraudulent. By 1 p.m., 3 of Beck's major cargo vessels were flagged and held at the Incheon port, freezing $12 million worth of time-sensitive inventory. Next, I contacted the financial journalist in Hong Kong. I handed him an ironclad, fully verified dossier detailing a massive, undetected embezzlement scheme inside the corporate real estate holdings of the 3 other bosses who had laughed the loudest at the tribunal. I didn't ask him to publish it immediately. I simply asked him to send a routine request for comment to their corporate offices, giving them a strict 2-hour deadline. The panic was instantaneous. By 1:30 p.m., my burner phones were ringing continuously. The arrogant, laughing men from the night before were suddenly messaging my husband, begging for an emergency audience, realizing that a silent, invisible force was surgically suffocating their businesses. At exactly 2 p.m., I walked into Suite 402 at the Grand Hyatt. Jaewon walked a step behind me. Boss Seo Jin was already sitting at the table, his face pale, his hands clasped tightly. Next to him sat his top corporate lawyer, looking thoroughly terrified. I didn't take the seat at the edge of the room this time. I sat directly at the head of the table. I opened a leather folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the polished wood toward Seo Jin. This is a full, legally binding restructuring agreement, I said. It permanently transfers the operational control of the Incheon shipping lines and the frozen Macau assets back to the Park organization. It also outlines a mutual defense pact. You will formally declare Kang Dong-soo's financial evidence to be fraudulent at the next syndicate gathering. Seojin's lawyer leaned over, reading the document frantically. He looked up at Seojin and gave a slow, grim nod. It was ironclad. Seojin stared at me, his eyes burning with resentment. You planned this. You sat in that room yesterday and let us think you were nothing. An enemy who thinks you are nothing is an enemy who makes mistakes, I replied, my voice dropping into a cold, dangerous register. Sign the paper, Seojin. Or I will let the government show you exactly what nothing feels like. With a trembling hand, Seojin pulled out his corporate stamp and pressed it firmly into the ink, signing his name on the dotted line. Now, I said, standing up and smoothing down my jacket. It's time to deal with the traitor. The final confrontation did not take place in a dark alley or a hidden warehouse. It took place in Kang Dong-soo's own lavish penthouse office overlooking the Han River at 5 p.m. When Jaewon and I walked in, unannounced, Dong-soo was pouring himself a glass of whiskey. He turned around, his silver hair perfectly styled, but his eyes narrowed when he saw the absolute lack of defeat on my husband's face. Jaewon, Dong-soo said, trying to maintain his arrogant posture. You shouldn't be here. The syndicate has made its decision. It's over. It is over, I said, stepping forward past my husband. But not for him. For you. Dong-soo let out a sharp, mocking laugh, adjusting his cufflinks. Amara. Please. Yesterday you were sitting against the wall like a ghost. Don't start playing the boss now. You have nowhere to go. I placed my laptop on his desk, spun it around, and hit play on a video file. The screen showed a high-definition recording of a private meeting inside a hotel room in Tokyo from 4 weeks ago. The audio was crystal clear. It was Kang Dong-soo, sitting across from a senior South Korean intelligence officer, handing over an encrypted drive and saying, "This will destroy Park Jae-won completely. Just make sure my name is scrubbed from the final indictment." Dong-soo's hand froze on his whiskey glass. The color completely drained from his face. The performance he had spent 3 years maintaining shattered in a single second. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "You spent 3 years watching my husband," I said, leaning over his desk, my dark eyes locked onto his panic-stricken face. "But you didn't spend a single second watching the woman who manages his life. I bought the security firm that handles that Tokyo hotel 2 years ago through a shell company in Nairobi. I have every conversation you've had in that room for 24 months. I opened a second folder on his desk. This is a full, unvarnished confession of your financial fraud, along with a complete reversal of the fraudulent bankruptcy claims you filed against the Park estate. You are going to sign it. Right now." Dong-soo backed away, his chest heaving. "And if I don't? You'll give this to the syndicate? They'll kill me." "No," I said, my voice deadpan and factual. "If you don't sign it, I won't give it to the syndicate. I will give it to the underlings of the 12 families you tried to frame. The young, angry men who don't care about syndicate politics. The ones who will look at this tape and realize you used their bosses as human shields. They won't just kill you, Dong-soo. They will erase your entire legacy." He looked at my husband, desperately searching for a shred of old brotherhood. "Jae-won, please. We were brothers for 22 years. You know me. Whatever I did because I had no choice. They had me. They had everything. I had no way out." His voice cracked, and for a moment he looked less like a criminal architect and more like a frightened old man pleading for the mercy he had never extended to anyone else. "You would have done the same. You know you would have." Jae-won stood perfectly still, his arms crossed, his face like carved granite. He didn't say a single word. He simply looked at me, giving Dong-soo his answer. "The brother you betrayed is no longer in charge. She is." And I could see what that cost him, the absolute silence in the face of 22 years. It was not coldness. It was grief, compressed into the shape of a decision. With a shaking hand, Kang Dong-soo reached for his pen. He signed the confession, his signature jagged and broken. The great architect of our downfall had been reduced to a terrified old man, completely undone by the woman he had dismissed as furniture. The next evening, the 12 allied families were called to a second, emergency gathering in the same mahogany boardroom. The atmosphere was completely different. The air was heavy with a thick, suffocating dread. Boss Beck sat silently, his hands in his pockets, his shipping empire currently paralyzed by my customs freeze. The other 3 bosses sat stiffly, having received the devastating requests for comment from Hong Kong. When the doors opened, my husband walked in first. But this time, he didn't sit down immediately. He walked over to the head of the table, pulled out the high-backed leather chair, and stood beside it. I walked into the room, wearing a striking, immaculate black suit. Jae-won looked at me. And for a breath, something passed across his face that had nothing to do with power or strategy or syndicate politics. It was the look of a man who had spent 14 years married to a woman he thought he understood, now seeing her clearly for the first time. Pride. Humility. Something that looked, quietly and unmistakably, like love recalibrated into something far deeper than it had been before. He pulled out the chair, a profound, public gesture of respect, and said, "Please, Amara." I took the seat at the head of the table. The absolute center of power. Jaiwan took the chair directly to my right, establishing our new, permanent side-by-side partnership. I looked across the long table. The 12 men stared back at me. There was no mockery. There was no laughter. Boss Beck looked down at the table, unable to meet my gaze. Boss Cho, the man who had chosen the cowardice of neutrality, looked utterly terrified. Kang Dong-soo will not be joining us tonight, I said, my voice echoing clearly off the wood panels. He has permanently retired from the organization and has signed over all his assets to the Park estate to correct his mathematical errors. I opened my folder, looking at each of them individually, memorizing their reactions one last time. Now, I said, leaning forward. Let's talk about the new terms of our business. And let's see who among you still finds the situation amusing. The room was completely, utterly silent. The loud mockers had been reduced to terrified compliance, entirely subdued by the quiet power they had failed to see. 2 days later, the storm had fully passed. The assets were unfrozen, the contracts were restored, and the organization was legally and financially more secure than it had ever been in its history. I was sitting in our living room, drinking tea in the quiet morning light, when the front door opened. Mrs. Park Sr., my formidable mother-in-law, walked into the apartment. She didn't have her usual entourage. She was alone. She walked slowly into the room, her obsidian eyes scanning the space until they landed on me. She stood there for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then, she bowed her head, a deep, traditional gesture of absolute respect that she had never, in her entire life, given to anyone outside of her late husband. "I was wrong," she said in clear, deliberate English. "You are not just harder than you look, Amara. You are the foundation of this family." "I simply do what is required to protect what is mine, Mother," I replied softly. She nodded once, a look of profound validation passing between us, and then she turned and left as quietly as she had arrived. Later that evening, Jaiwan sat beside me as we watched the sun set over the city. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he reached over and placed his hand over mine, the same way I had placed mine over his in that dark bedroom. And said nothing, because there was nothing sufficient to say. The gesture was the language. He had spent a lifetime leading with authority, and here he was, learning for the first time what it meant to simply be held in someone else's competence and love and not feel diminished by it. I thought about my mother sitting at her kitchen table in Nairobi with her red pen. I thought about my father arriving home at exactly 6:15. I thought about the immense emotional toll of carrying an empire in complete silence, of letting people think you are nothing so that you can build the walls that will eventually save their lives. Silence is not absence. Silence is not weakness. Silence is a container. It holds everything you know until the exact moment arrives when knowledge must become action. A quiet woman can carry an empire without anyone noticing. Not because she has to, but because she understands completely that the most consequential strength does not announce itself. The most powerful position in any room is always the chair against the wall, because from that chair, if you are truly paying attention, you can calculate everything. My name is Amara Wanjiku Park. And they will never laugh at my husband's name again.